Okay, we're back and we're looking at, we're continuing with Robert Sokolowski's Introduction to Philosophy, and now we're moving on to the chapter on the three formal structures of phenomenology. And so first we have the intentional structure of parts and wholes, B, the intentional structure of identity in a manifold, and C, the intentional structure of presence and absence. So when we look at parts and wholes, we're looking at pieces and moments. So in other words, pieces are detachable things from the whole, such as leaves from a tree, whereas moments cannot be detached, so they're considered non-independent parts, like the color red, or when we look at physics, for example, with the body in motion, whereby we have velocity, momentum, acceleration, and force. All of those are moments whereby they're non-independent parts of how it is that we understand a body in motion. So I found this quote of Sokolowski's: whenever we think about something, we articulate parts and wholes within it. So the structure of parts and wholes goes beyond sensibility. So in other words, this is something that these connections that we make with parts and wholes in our thinking is a metaphysical way in which we're organizing our thinking, okay? And then also, I forgot to mention in the first video that Robert Sokolowski is a mathematician, or was a mathematician, and so when we start thinking about the relationship of parts to wholes, obviously we could think of connections to math, right? With what? Addition, subtraction, multiplication, all are variants on the part of something and how that's in relation to the whole, etc. And then the next structure is the next phenomenological formal structure is identity in a manifold. So recall the distinction with what is expressed and what is the expression. So in other words, what is the expression? It also has differing forms. So in other words, there's different forms of identifying things. So different ways of presenting something in a multiplicity of identification. So in other words, the thing can always be presented in more ways than we already know. The thing will always hold more appearances in reserve. And so the easiest way to do that is when we think of particular people as well. So a person can be a daughter, as well as a mother, as well as a nurse, as well as a sister, as well as a philosopher, as well as a student, and then also by way of being an American citizen, for example, or a Denverite. So all of these ways are identities in a manifold, whereby the different expressions of how it is that we identify this person are ways that we understand who that person is and how that person appears to us in experience, and how she appears to herself as well. So there's always a relationship of self to other people, etc. Okay? So then what is phenomenological analysis? Phenomenological analysis itself is describing the manifold that is proper to a given type of object. So in other words, when we're thinking of what phenomenology is and how things appear to us in a manifold of ways in which what we're doing as phenomenologists is disclosing what that identity of appearances is for any particular idea, person, thing, etc., right? So identity is then likewise understood metaphysically, and there's also a way that we're thinking of personal identity, as I also mentioned, whereby we have a way that we understand ourselves too, by way of memory, imagination, perceptions as well, that also contribute to our identity and how we understand ourselves. So those are manifolds of ourselves as well. So in other words, how you identify yourself and how others identify you are by way of these memories, imaginations, perceptions, connections, affiliations, job affiliations, likewise personal affiliations, filial, etc. So there's this multiplicity of ways in which we identify ourselves and also other people that give us a better understanding of how we experience ourselves and other people. Okay? So then we have presence and absence. And then also identity in a manifold could also be understood mathematically as well, in the sense that we have different ways in which we could understand a solution to a problem mathematically, right? So in other words, 1 plus 1 equals 2, but likewise 3 minus 1 can also be representative of 2 as well, right? So in other words, there's different ways in which we could understand things mathematically that give us a different identity of the same number, okay? So then also we have presence and absence, and as I was indicating in the first video, presence and absence is Husserl's innovation, and so probably a little more needs to be said about that in terms of, there's always the idea of presence and absence in the way that we think. His innovation is to draw attention to it, okay? So it's not like he invented what presence and absence is, it's more he elaborated on it in a way that philosophers haven't done beforehand, okay? So presence and absence correlates with what are called filled intentions, and filled intentions are what is present to consciousness. So for example, this window right now is present to my consciousness, whereby for you, it's emptily intended. So this window for you, you are knowing it whereas that the window is absent to you when you're watching this video, okay? So in other words, it's not present to your consciousness, only present virtually by way of it being intentionally filled for me, okay? So there's that difference between what's called filled intentions and empty intentions. Empty intentions are things that we understand that are not at our immediate perceptual grasp, okay? So in other words, I know that New York exists, but right now I don't have a perceptual grasp of New York City in my immediate reach. Things like that, okay? I mean, there's countless other examples, but that's one way of thinking about it. So then, empty and filled intending are directed to one and the same thing, object and person. So in other words, we have ways of thinking that incorporate presence and absence, or empty and filled intentions as well, right? That in other words, things are present to us and likewise things are absent to us, and both are working in a way that we're understanding things. And one thing we could think of there that we've been looking at before in this class is the principle of non-contradiction. Principle of non-contradiction is incorporating presence and absence in how things are understood as well. So just outright negation is also a way that we understand things that are immediate to our grasp as well. So then absence accounts for things and or ideas that are forgotten. Likewise, there's also concealment, secrecy, also lying as well can be an element of, can be a way that we're considering what absence is here in contrast to what is present. Things that are not truthful, etc., are ways of thinking that incorporate absence. So that's really interesting because we usually think of lying obviously as something that's not true and that needs to be then verified with truth. And we don't necessarily see it in and of itself as something that is a part of consciousness. We see it as an aberration of consciousness, but actually it's a part of conscious experience as well. And so there's an interesting element of truth, even to concealment and fiction and things that are not quote unquote real. That things that fantasy, life, etc. is also an experience of consciousness as well, and that's incorporating this element of absence, because the element of absence for a phenomenologist has to do with that which is not present. But there's a lot of things in our lives that are not present that we take into account that have to do with how it is that things appear to us and how is it that we have knowledge of things. So this presence and absence is also quite profound, right? And then so identity is also understood and established in the intentionality of presence and absence. In other words, that's part of the way that we identify things. And I think that should be, that should carry over to the previous examples I just gave. So why don't we just end it from here? And I think that should get us on the road to understanding the three formal structures of phenomenology. And thanks. We'll talk more about it later.